This fictional cosmic horror broadcast is inspired by AM radio technology, real space science, and reported folklore associated with an earlier KLYC facility. All characters, recordings, technical incidents, and anomalous events are fictional. This production is not affiliated with KLYC, the FCC, or any government agency.
The main breaker is open. The antenna feed is disconnected and lying on the floor 6 feet from the cabinet. Plate voltage is at 0. Filament current is falling. The transmitter temperature has dropped below 90 degrees. There should be nothing leaving this room. But the field monitor still shows a carrier on 1260 kilohertz, and the measurement it has been repeating since 4:18 this morning still indicates 2 occupants. I am alone inside the building. If anyone finds this recording, do not restart the transmitter to confirm what I am about to describe. The warm-up cycle is not causing the problem. The warm-up cycle is allowing the problem to see the room. My name is Thomas Mercer. I am a contract broadcast engineer working in Yamhill County, Oregon. This recording began as maintenance documentation for the old backup transmitter at KLYC, 1260 AM, McMinnville. The date is October 19, 1991. The time is 4:22 in the morning. I am recording from the former equipment room at the rear of the station building. The room is approximately 14 feet long, 11 feet wide, and just under 9 feet from the floor to the acoustic tile. There is one door behind me, no exterior windows, one ventilation duct in the northwest corner, and a narrow cable passage through the south wall. The room contains the backup transmitter, a modulation monitor, a frequency counter, 2 equipment racks, an audio distribution panel, a utility shelf, and a metal service cart. Nothing else in here should be capable of transmitting. I was called in because of intermittent carrier drift during the morning warm-up period. The reported drift was small enough that most listeners would never hear it, but large enough to appear on the station monitor. The irregularity had been noticed 3 times during the previous month. Each report placed it between 4 and 5 in the morning, during the period when the old equipment had been brought from standby to full operating temperature. The staff had another explanation for it. Several people had reported the feeling that someone was standing inside the equipment room when the transmitter became hot. I want the record to show that I did not come here to investigate that claim. Old transmitter rooms produce physical sensations that are easy to misinterpret. Large transformers vibrate at the power line frequency. Fans create pressure changes. Relays move without warning. Heated dust produces a smell people associate with occupied houses. Metal panels expand and settle. Fluorescent fixtures flicker at the edge of vision. A person standing alone in a warm room filled with high voltage can become acutely aware of every sound and every movement. There was no reason to assume anything unusual. I arrived shortly after 3:30. The station's overnight programming was being carried through the main transmitter, so the backup unit was isolated from the antenna system. That allowed me to test it into a dummy load without placing an unstable carrier on the air. The first 30 minutes were ordinary. I checked the cabinet grounds, inspected the blower assembly, tested the interlocks, and measured resistance across the audio input. I found dust, 2 loose screws, a cracked belt on the ventilation fan, and 1 relay contact that needed cleaning. Those were maintenance problems. None explained the frequency drift. At 3:53, I energized the filament circuit. The blower started first, then the cabinet fan. The low voltage supply stabilized within tolerance. The room temperature was 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The interior temperature of the transmitter cabinet was 71. I allowed the unit to warm gradually. At 3:59, the cabinet reached 78 degrees. The carrier oscillator remained stable. At 4:03, the cabinet reached 84 degrees, still stable. At 4:07, I noticed a shallow drop in the background noise on the modulation monitor. That requires explanation. Every electrical component generates some noise. As components become warmer, that noise generally becomes more noticeable. Not necessarily audible to a listener, but measurable. The monitor should have shown a slightly broader noise floor as the transmitter heated. Instead, a narrow section of the noise began disappearing. At first, I assumed the monitor was defective. I connected the spare monitor. The same narrow absence appeared on its display. I connected the frequency analyzer directly across the dummy load sampler. The absence was there too. At 4:12, the transmitter cabinet reached 89 degrees. The missing section widened. At 4:14, it separated into two clean notches positioned on either side of the carrier. They were almost symmetrical, but not perfectly. The lower notch was narrower. The upper notch drifted by several cycles every time the ventilation fan changed speed. That suggested mechanical vibration or a grounding problem. I recorded the display, then switched the fan to manual. The fan slowed. The cabinet temperature rose. The upper notch stopped drifting. The lower notch remained where it was. At 4:16, the cabinet reached 94 degrees. That was when I first experienced the sensation the staff had described. I did not hear footsteps. I did not see a figure. Nothing touched me. I simply became certain that the empty space behind my right shoulder was occupied. It was not the vague anxiety of being alone. It had direction, distance, even height. Someone seemed to be standing approximately 6 feet behind me, slightly closer to the transmitter than to the door. I turned around. The room was empty. The sensation ended as soon as I looked directly at the space. When I faced the monitor again, it returned. I attributed it to infrasound from the ventilation system. Low-frequency vibration can create pressure sensations, discomfort, and an impression that something is moving nearby. That explanation remained reasonable for approximately 2 minutes. At 4:18, the analyzer produced the first pulse. The pulse lasted less than half a second. 12.6 seconds later, it repeated. Then again. The interval was exact to the limit of my equipment. 12.6 seconds. The station frequency is 1260 kilohertz. I assumed the timing had been generated by a divider circuit somewhere in the transmitter. I began tracing the path. That was my first mistake. I treated the number as a product of the machine. It was not. It was an identification. At 4:24, the pulses had repeated 28 times without measurable variation. Every pulse caused the two notches beside the carrier to deepen. Between pulses, they became shallow but never disappeared. I disconnected the audio input. No change. I grounded the audio terminals. No change. I removed the remote control connection, isolated the frequency counter, switched off the overhead fluorescent lights, and disconnected the wall clock. The pattern continued. I checked the room for another receiver or transmitter. There was a portable radio on the service shelf, but it contained no batteries. I removed it anyway and placed it in the hallway. No change. I shut off the ventilation fan. The room became quieter. The cabinet temperature climbed more quickly. The presence behind me became stronger. I dislike using that word. Presence implies a person or an entity. I had no evidence of either. What I experienced was a persistent conviction that a human-sized volume of space was occupied. That is the most precise language I can offer. The feeling did not move when I moved my head. It did not disappear when I closed my eyes. It remained in the same part of the room, 6 feet behind my position at the monitor. I stepped aside. The sensation did not remain behind me. It stayed beside the transmitter. That distinction mattered. If vibration or sound had created a false impression relative to my body, the perceived position should have moved with me. It did not. The location was fixed inside the room. I marked it with tape on the floor. The mark is still there now. A small cross approximately 30 inches from the west cabinet and 41 inches from the south wall. There was no electrical conduit beneath that point according to the station plans. No ventilation return, no pipe, no structural post. I placed a microphone stand on the mark and suspended a small accelerometer from it. The accelerometer showed nothing unusual. I measured the magnetic field. Nothing beyond what I expected near a powered transmitter. I checked the floor temperature. It was 2 degrees cooler at the tape mark than beside the cabinet, but that could be explained by air circulation. I moved the thermometer. The cool area seemed to follow the mark. I repeated the measurement from 4 directions. The center of the temperature difference remained within 6 inches of the same position. Again, 2 degrees was not significant. The thermometer was not calibrated for investigative work. Airflow in that room was uneven. I wrote down the result but did not treat it as evidence. At 4:29, the analyzer pulse changed. Until then, each pulse had produced a single clean depression in the noise. Now each depression contained a series of smaller steps. 5 steps on the lower side, 7 on the upper. The pattern resembled reflected energy returning along several paths, except nothing was being transmitted through the antenna. The unit was operating into a dummy load. A dummy load absorbs radio frequency energy and converts it to heat. It allows a transmitter to be tested without broadcasting normally. There can be leakage. Any high-power radio equipment can produce a weak local field, but leakage could not explain a timed return pattern appearing simultaneously across 2 isolated monitors. I moved the spare monitor into the hallway. The pulse remained visible there, but it was weaker. I carried it farther toward the control booth. At approximately 22 feet from the equipment room door, the pulse vanished. When I brought the monitor back, the pulse returned. That suggested a local field confined to the rear portion of the building. I began checking the walls. The south wall produced the strongest response. The west wall produced the weakest. The floor and ceiling were nearly identical. I thought there might be a damaged cable inside the wall, acting as an unintended antenna. I disconnected every line entering through the south cable passage. Program audio, remote meter wiring, telephone coupler, alarm circuit, intercom, ground reference. By the time I finished, the transmitter was electrically isolated from the rest of the station except for mains power. The pulse remained. The room temperature had reached 79 degrees. The transmitter cabinet was 108. The temperature difference at the taped floor mark had increased from 2 degrees to 4. I placed a second thermometer at the same height on the opposite side of the cabinet. The air beside the cabinet was warmer, as expected. The air at the taped mark was cooler, but the surface of the floor at that mark was warmer. I repeated the readings twice. Warm floor, cool air. That combination suggested energy entering the floor while something above it removed heat from the surrounding air. I had no mechanism for that. I also had no confidence in the instruments. At 4:35, I decided to cool the transmitter and repeat the entire warm-up cycle. I reduced power, opened the cabinet ventilation, and restored the fan. The pattern weakened as the temperature fell. At 100 degrees, the stepped structure disappeared. At 96, the 2 notches began narrowing. At 92, the 12.6-second pulse became irregular. At 89, it stopped. The sensation beside the cabinet disappeared at the same moment. Not gradually. It was present, then it was absent. I stood at the monitor for 2 full minutes. Nothing returned. The room felt like a room again. That should have ended the test. A temperature-dependent fault would have explained every measurable feature except the cool air and warm floor, and both could have resulted from poor instruments. I should have documented the threshold, recommended replacement of the oscillator assembly, and left. Instead, I started a second warm-up cycle. I wanted the failure to repeat. I wanted to prove that the staff had mistaken a predictable equipment fault for something supernatural. At 4:41, I closed the filament circuit again. At 4:48, the cabinet passed 89 degrees. The pulse returned, exactly 12.6 seconds apart. But this time, before I moved or touched any equipment, the 2 notches were in different positions. I compared the new tracing with the first. 1 notch had shifted approximately 14% toward the carrier. The other had moved less than 2%. Nothing inside the transmitter had been rearranged. The only significant change inside the room was my position. During the first cycle, I had stood directly in front of the monitor. During the second, I was standing beside the service cart. I returned to my original position. 12.6 seconds later, the first notch moved back. I did not understand the result immediately. I moved left. I waited. 12.6 seconds later, the lower notch widened. I moved right. I waited. The notch narrowed. I stepped closer to the transmitter. Both notches moved away from the carrier. I stepped back. They moved inward. The equipment was responding to my position with a delay of 12.6 seconds. That sentence is easy to say now. It was not easy to accept while standing there. I tested every ordinary explanation I could think of. My body might have changed the local electrical field. My movement might have changed the floor loading, cabinet vibration, or airflow. My shoes might have carried static charge. The tools in my pockets might have disturbed the field. But none of those effects should have waited 12.6 seconds before appearing. They should have been immediate. I removed my tools and placed them outside. I grounded myself to the cabinet chassis. I stood on a rubber mat. The delayed response continued. Then I tested the service cart. The cart was steel, 3 feet high, with 2 shelves and rubber wheels. I placed it near the door. I marked its position. I moved it exactly 3 feet toward the transmitter, then stepped away. 12.6 seconds later, a new deformation appeared in the upper notch. I returned the cart to the door. 12.6 seconds later, the deformation reversed. The pattern was not reacting specifically to a living body. It was reacting to conductive mass inside the room. I placed a wrench on the center shelf. The corresponding change was too small to distinguish. I placed the entire metal toolbox on the cart. The change became visible. I moved the cart to 3 different positions, recorded the waveform each time, and drew the results on graph paper. The waveform contained crude positional information. Not enough to produce a photograph, not enough to identify an object, but enough to distinguish between the cabinet, the service cart, the equipment racks, and a human body. I began plotting the strongest reflections as coordinates. The scale made no sense. A signal at 1260 kHz has a wavelength hundreds of feet long. It cannot resolve objects separated by a few feet with the precision I was seeing. Even if harmonics were involved, the equipment available in that room could not generate the bandwidth required to map small objects. There was another problem. A transmitter operating into a dummy load sends out energy but does not listen for returns. There was no receiver in the circuit. The modulation monitors could sample the output. The analyzer could display it, but neither could explain how the physical arrangement of the room was being measured. I checked the analyzer input to make sure I had not accidentally created a receiving antenna. I terminated it locally. The pattern remained. I disconnected the analyzer entirely. The pattern remained on the modulation monitor. I removed the monitor. The pattern remained on the frequency counter as a repeating instability in the last digits. The instruments were not creating it. They were only translating different portions of the same event. At 5:06, I completed the first rough map. The cabinet appeared as the largest stable feature. The equipment racks appeared as 2 narrow vertical structures. The cart appeared near the door. My position appeared in front of the workbench. And beside the transmitter, at the cross I had placed on the floor, there was another feature. It was approximately my height. Narrower across the shoulders, motionless. I had not added it deliberately. I assumed I had misinterpreted a reflection from the cabinet door. I opened the cabinet. The feature remained. I closed it. No change. I moved the cart between the feature and the monitor. The cart's pattern shifted. The feature did not. I stood directly on the tape mark. The sensation of occupancy vanished. For several seconds, I believed that confirmed a psychological explanation. The mark no longer felt occupied because I occupied it myself. Then the next pulse appeared. The waveform did not show one combined human-sized feature. It showed 2. One was my body. The other was displaced approximately 18 inches behind me. I stepped off the mark. 12.6 seconds later, my pattern moved. The second remained. That was the first moment I considered leaving. Not because I believed in a ghost, because I had produced repeatable evidence of an object that none of my senses could detect. I could feel the occupied volume when I was outside it. I could not feel anything when I stood inside it. The thermometer showed cooler air around it. The floor beneath it was warmer. The transmitter pattern represented it as conductive mass, but light passed through the space. My hand passed through it. The microphone stand occupied the same location without resistance. I placed a sheet of paper vertically across the mark. It did not move. I released a thread above it to test the air. The thread curved slightly toward the center, not away from the transmitter's ventilation, toward the empty space. The airflow was weak but persistent. Cool air was moving inward. The feature was not radiating heat. It was removing it. I switched on a tape recorder near the mark and recorded 30 seconds of room tone. Playback contained the fan, cabinet hum, rain, and my own movement. No voice, no whisper, no footsteps. There was no hidden message in the sound. That is important. Whatever the transmitter was detecting did not attempt to communicate. It did not say my name. It did not ask for help. It did not warn me. It behaved like an instrument reading, cold, repetitive, automatic. The horror was not that something inside the room wanted me to hear it. The horror was that it did not appear to care whether I knew it was there. At 5:13, I focused on the delay. 12.6 seconds separated every physical change from its appearance in the pattern. A local electrical fault might repeat at that interval, but it should not reproduce the position of objects moved inside the room. A mechanical system might take time to stabilize, but the delay was too precise. I moved the cart 5 times at irregular intervals. Every corresponding change appeared 12.6 seconds later. Not 12.5, not 12.7. Within the limits of the counter, 12.6. A radio signal travels close to the speed of light. If the delay represented a round trip, outward travel, reflection or processing, and return, the total path would be millions of miles. I calculated it twice because I did not trust the result. The corresponding one-way distance was approximately 1.9 million kilometers, far beyond the moon. Not enough to reach another planet. Not associated with any obvious object I knew. There was no reason to believe the delay represented distance. It might have been an internal processing interval, or a number chosen because of the station frequency. But the station had not chosen it. I changed the exciter frequency. I moved 10 kilohertz lower into an unassigned test position and kept the output confined to the dummy load. The pulse interval remained 12.6 seconds. I moved 10 kilohertz higher. No change. I switched to the low-power oscillator. The interval remained. The system was not deriving the delay from the active frequency. It was preserving the station's normal identity after the frequency changed. 1260. That was when I began to suspect the pattern was not a natural reflection. A natural process does not know a station's assigned frequency. A fault might preserve a number through divider circuitry, but most of the circuitry capable of doing that had already been disconnected. Something in the event identified the equipment as KLYC 1260, even when the oscillator was no longer operating at 1260. I examined the first pulse from the first warm-up cycle. Its structure was slightly different from later pulses. The initial event contained a broad sweep, followed by the 2 notches. I slowed the paper recording and measured the sweep. It crossed the occupied bandwidth from low to high, paused at the center, then returned. That resembled calibration. The first pulse had tested the available range. The later pulses had used it. I looked at the map again. The equipment room was not simply reflected in the waveform. It had been measured after the first sweep. The process began when the cabinet reached a specific temperature. It used thermal noise already present in the conductors. The noise did not increase as expected because part of its randomness was being reorganized. That is not supposed to be possible. Thermal noise is random electrical fluctuation. It can be measured and filtered, but a transmitter cannot decide to turn it into structured information, unless the transmitter was not doing the organizing. Suppose an external system could detect weak variations inside the station's electrical conductors. Suppose it could use the transmitter's own heat as a broad, naturally generated source. Each warm conductor would produce noise. Each object and person in the room would slightly alter the local field. With enough measurements, enough sensitivity, and enough processing, those alterations could theoretically contain information about the space, not at the resolution I observed, not through the equipment I had, not with any technology I knew, but the structure resembled a scan more than a broadcast. The transmitter was not hearing a voice. It was illuminating the room. The repeating signal was not speech. It was a measurement cycle. And the feature beside the cabinet was not necessarily standing inside the room. It could have been part of the measuring system, a reference point. A second path. An aperture located somewhere the room did not physically contain. At 5:21, the feature moved. Until then, it had remained fixed over the tape cross. It shifted 6 inches toward me. There was no gradual transition. One pulse showed it at the mark. The next showed it closer. I had not moved. The cart had not moved. The cabinet temperature remained stable. For the first time, the room map had changed without a visible cause. I stepped toward the door. 12.6 seconds later, my position changed in the waveform. The second feature remained closer than before. I stepped farther away. My return appeared. The second feature shifted another 6 inches toward the monitor. It did not follow me. It moved toward the equipment interpreting the signal. I placed the spare monitor on the opposite side of the room. The feature changed direction. It moved toward the spare monitor. I switched the spare monitor off. The feature returned toward the main display. It was not approaching a person. It was approaching observation. That distinction frightened me more than if it had followed my body. The process seemed aware of where its measurement was being examined, not who was examining it. Where? I covered the display with a cloth. No change. I turned away. The sensation behind me intensified, but the waveform continued. Observation did not require my eyes. It required an active system converting the signal into a form available inside the room. The feature was locating the point where its own measurement became visible. At 5:27, it reached the monitor rack. The next pulse contained a third notch. The third notch was smaller than the other two and located close to the carrier center. It appeared for 4 pulses, then divided. The resulting pattern resembled 2 narrow vertical columns. I had no automatic imaging software. Everything I understood came from comparing paper traces, positions, and timing. I moved my hand toward the monitor. One column changed after the delay. The other did not. I stepped left. The first moved with me. The second remained directly in front of the display. I began referring to the patterns as occupancy markers. That was not a technical term. It was a practical label. Marker 1 corresponded to me. Marker 2 corresponded to the invisible feature. I wrote the following in the maintenance log. Occupancy Marker 1, mobile, visible source. Occupancy Marker 2, mobile, source not visible. Both markers similar in vertical extent. Marker 2 appears associated with active monitoring equipment. I did not write person. I did not write ghost. I wrote source not visible. At 5:32, I turned off the main monitor. Marker 2 vanished from the spare display. I switched the monitor on. After 12.6 seconds, Marker 2 returned. I turned off the spare and left the main active. The marker moved back to the main rack. This was repeatable. The invisible feature did not exist in one fixed position. It appeared where the anomaly was measured. That eliminated my earlier assumption that something physical stood beside the transmitter. The cool air, warm floor, and sense of occupancy were secondary effects around the measurement location. The feature was not an occupant in the ordinary meaning. It was where the observing process touched the room. I compared it to a camera aperture, though no light was involved. If a camera could project the idea of its lens into the space being photographed, Marker 2 might have represented that projection. It was the local end of something extending elsewhere. I needed an independent detector. I had a battery-powered field strength meter in my vehicle. It was designed to measure local broadcast signals without being connected to station equipment. I lowered the transmitter to minimum test power but left it warm. Then I walked outside. The rain had weakened. The tower lights were visible through low fog. The field meter showed no meaningful radiated carrier because the transmitter remained connected to the dummy load. I returned to the hallway. The meter began moving near the equipment room door. Inside the room, it registered a weak carrier. The carrier did not peak near the transmitter cabinet. It peaked near the active monitor. I turned the monitor off. After 12.6 seconds, the field meter dropped. I turned it on. The signal returned. That meant the monitor was no longer merely displaying the anomaly. It was becoming part of the field. The measurement process used whatever equipment observed it as a new source. A chain. Transmitter noise entered the monitor. The monitor displayed the pattern. The pattern established itself around the monitor. Another instrument detected that field. If the second instrument remained active long enough, the feature moved toward it. Every attempt to observe the anomaly gave it another point of access. I unplugged the spare monitor. I switched off the field meter. I disconnected the frequency analyzer. Only the main modulation monitor remained active. The second occupancy marker consolidated beside it. The sense of someone standing behind me became stronger than before. This time, I could identify a boundary. When I moved my hand through the area beside the monitor, my skin became cold at one precise plane. Beyond the plane, the temperature returned to normal. The boundary was less than an inch thick. I passed my hand through it again. Cold, then normal. No resistance. No static shock. Only a sudden loss of heat. I held the thermometer against the boundary. The reading dropped 6 degrees in approximately 20 seconds. I pulled it away. The temperature recovered. The boundary was drawing thermal energy from anything placed through it. That gave me another test. I switched off the transmitter heaters but left the monitor active. As the cabinet cooled, the pattern weakened. The boundary beside the monitor became harder to locate. When the cabinet reached 92 degrees, the smaller details disappeared. At 89, the regular pulse failed. Marker 1, my marker, vanished first. Marker 2 remained. For approximately 40 seconds, the equipment could no longer detect my body, the cart, or the racks. It detected only the feature beside the monitor. Then that disappeared too. The room warmed normally after it was gone. The cold plane vanished. Nothing remained on the monitor. I should have stopped there. Instead, I tried to understand why Marker 2 persisted longer than the room itself. There was only one reasonable interpretation. Marker 1 and the room map were produced from the transmitter's thermal noise. As the transmitter cooled, the illuminating source weakened and the map faded. Marker 2 did not depend on the map in the same way. It was not an object being measured. It belonged to the system performing the measurement. It was the last part to disappear because it was the connection, not the subject. The presence reported in the equipment room was not something trapped inside the building. It was the sensation of being on the observed side of an opening. At 5:43, I prepared one final test. I know that decision was irresponsible. At the time, I believed complete isolation would either stop the process or identify its path. I restarted the warm-up cycle with only the essential transmitter systems connected. No station audio, no remote wiring, no telephone lines, no external frequency reference, no modulation monitor until the cabinet reached operating temperature. I placed the battery field meter in the hallway and left it switched off. I placed the portable radio beside it with fresh batteries installed. The radio was tuned to 1260 but kept off. I wanted to know whether the anomaly could establish itself without an active observer. At 5:51, the cabinet passed 89 degrees. No pulse appeared because no monitor was connected. The room felt normal. At 94 degrees, still nothing. At 100, I experienced mild pressure in my ears but no directional sense of occupancy. At 105, the transmitter's frequency counter began changing. The last digits alternated between two values. The pattern repeated every 12.6 seconds. Even without the monitor, the process had returned through the counter. I disconnected the counter. The plate current meter began moving. A mechanical needle. No digital processor. No audio circuit. No receiver. Every 12.6 seconds, it fell by approximately 2%, then recovered. I opened the main breaker. The transmitter shut down. The hum collapsed. The blower coasted. The plate current needle returned to zero. The room fell silent except for rain and the slowing fan. I waited. 12.6 seconds after the breaker opened, the plate current needle moved below zero. That should not be possible. The meter can overshoot during shutdown, but this occurred after the circuit had settled. It moved left, rested there for half a second, and returned. 12.6 seconds later, it happened again. There was no plate voltage, no measurable current, yet the meter repeated the pulse. I discharged the power supply according to procedure. I verified 0 voltage. The needle continued moving. I disconnected 1 meter lead. The needle stopped. That seemed to identify residual electrical coupling. Then the disconnected field meter in the hallway produced an audible relay click. I had left it switched off. I walked to the hallway. Its power switch remained in the off position. The meter needle was moving every 12.6 seconds. The portable radio beside it was also off. Its speaker produced a soft pulse in the same rhythm. I removed the radio batteries. The pulse continued. Not loudly, not like a broadcast. A small movement of the paper cone, followed by silence. I carried both devices outside. The field meter stopped approximately 30 feet from the equipment room door. The radio stopped several feet later. I brought them back. They resumed. The signal remained localized to the building. I returned to the equipment room and physically disconnected the transmitter output from the dummy load. I removed the exciter module. I opened the cabinet doors and verified every supply was falling normally. The transmitter was no longer capable of generating a carrier. The portable radio still detected one. That is where this recording began. The main breaker is open. The antenna feed is disconnected. Plate voltage is 0. The cabinet is cooling. There should be nothing leaving this room, but something is still using 1260 to describe it. At 5:58, the field meter began showing 2 distinct peaks. One centered at the transmitter cabinet, the other centered at me. I walked toward the door. The second peak moved after the delay. The first remained. That appeared to reverse the earlier map. Now the transmitter was the fixed marker and I was the moving one. Then I realized the first peak was not centered on the transmitter. It was centered on the tape cross. The original location of Marker 2. The connection had returned to its first position because every display inside the room had been shut down. When there was nowhere else for the observation to emerge, it returned to the place where staff had sensed it for years. That implies the point existed before the monitor, before my test, possibly before the current transmitter. The equipment had not created the opening. It had heated the room enough to make the opening measurable. I checked the old floor plan. The taped cross stood over no wiring, but the original 1949 plan showed something the newer drawing did not. A grounding junction had once been installed beneath that section of floor. The junction connected the transmitter ground to several buried radial conductors extending outward from the building. The junction had been relocated during later renovation, but portions of the original copper system remained beneath the concrete. Long conductors buried in the ground can collect and distribute radio frequency energy. That could explain why the location mattered. It could not explain the room map. It could not explain the delay. It could not explain why the signal knew the station frequency after the oscillator changed. But it suggested a larger shape. The room was only the visible end of a conductive system extending beneath the property. The buried radials spread outward in dozens of lines. From above, they would resemble a wheel or an eye. The transmitter heated. Thermal noise entered the ground network. The network illuminated the building. Something at an unknown distance returned the structure. The feature inside the room was where that return converged. We had not been broadcasting into empty air. For years, every warm-up cycle may have repeated the same measurement. Different technicians, different announcers, different objects placed in the room. One fixed observation point. The stories of a presence were not separate encounters. They were reception reports. At 6:03, the cabinet temperature dropped below 90 degrees. The pulse weakened but did not stop. At 6:05, it became irregular. At 6:07, the portable radio finally went silent. The field meter returned to 0. The cold boundary at the tape mark disappeared. I waited another 5 minutes. Nothing resumed. I packed the analyzer, removed my temporary wiring, and closed the cabinet doors. The station's morning operations would begin soon. I intended to leave the transmitter disconnected and recommend that it remain out of service. I carried my tools into the control booth. The building felt normal again. The main console was operating. The program feed was stable. The primary transmitter showed normal power. No anomalous carrier appeared on the station monitor. I began completing the maintenance report. At 6:14, the weather teletype activated. The machine received regional weather information over a wired service. It printed local temperature, pressure, visibility, wind, and forecast material for the morning announcer. The first lines were ordinary. McMinnville, 48 degrees. Salem, 51. Newburgh, 47. Visibility reduced in patchy fog. Light rain ending after sunrise. Then the printer stopped. The paper remained still for approximately 12 seconds. It printed another line. KLYC equipment room, 78 degrees. I assumed I had typed a note into the wrong system, or that someone had configured a local temperature sensor. But there was no sensor connected to the weather service. The line continued. KLYC equipment room, 78 degrees. Occupancy, 2. I tore the paper from the machine. The printer paused. Then it produced the same line again. I checked the data connection. It ran through a telephone line completely separate from the backup transmitter. I disconnected the line. The printer continued. Equipment room, 77 degrees. Occupancy, 2. The temperature was accurate. I had left a thermometer inside the equipment room. Before leaving, I had noted 78 degrees. The printer was now following the cooling room without any connected sensor. I returned to the equipment room. The thermometer read 77. The room was empty. The transmitter was cold enough that no pulse appeared on the portable radio. I stepped into the hallway. The teletype in the distant control booth activated. When I returned, it had printed, Equipment room, 77 degrees. Occupancy, 1. The number changed after I left. That established that one occupancy marker had represented me. The other remained inside the empty equipment room. I stood in the control booth and waited. The printer updated again. Equipment room, 76 degrees. Occupancy, 1. Control booth, 71 degrees. Occupancy, 1. For several minutes that seemed consistent. One unobserved occupant in the equipment room. One human occupant in the control booth. Then I noticed the timing. The equipment room update appeared 12.6 seconds after each temperature change. The control booth update appeared immediately when I moved. The system was measuring me locally now. It no longer required the round-trip delay. I switched off the teletype. It continued printing. I unplugged it. The paper advanced another line. There was no electricity connected to the machine. The keys did not move. The motor did not turn. Yet dark characters appeared across the paper as if heat were developing ink from beneath the surface. Control booth, 71 degrees. Occupancy, 2. I looked around the booth. One console, 2 chairs, a microphone, 2 turntables, A cart machine. No one else. The door was open. The hallway was visible. The front entrance remained locked. I carried the paper into the hall. The characters continued forming. Control booth, 71 degrees. Occupancy, 2. Equipment room, 76 degrees. Occupancy, 0. The second marker had left the equipment room. It had moved to the booth, not through the hallway, not through a door. It moved to the place where I was reading the measurement. The same behavior it had shown with the monitors. It followed observation. The equipment room had been the first active display, then the modulation monitor, then the field meter, now the weather paper. Every system used to examine it became the next point at which it appeared. I placed the paper face down. The writing stopped. I turned it over. A new line formed. Observation active. That is the only phrase in this recording I cannot explain as a label derived from my own notes. I had used the word observation several times on this tape. The system may have extracted it from the recording, or I may be assigning meaning to a coincidence. The next line removed that possibility. Observation active, KLYC, 1260. Subject count, 1. Observer count, 1. Until that moment, I had assumed occupancy 2 meant 2 subjects inside the same space. It did not. One of the markers was the subject. The other was the observer. I was not sharing the room with an invisible person. The room was being occupied from 2 sides. It is now 6:28 in the morning. The primary transmitter remains operating normally. I have not interrupted the station's program feed. Anyone listening to 1260 outside this building should hear ordinary programming. I am using a separate recorder. The backup transmitter remains disconnected. The weather teletype remains unplugged. The paper is still developing new lines. Control booth temperature, 72 degrees. Subject count, 1. Observer count, 1. I moved the recorder into the hallway. 12.6 seconds later, the paper identified the hallway. The observer marker remained in the control booth until I carried the paper with me. Then it appeared in the hallway. This confirms that the anomaly does not follow my body. It follows the act of measurement. I considered destroying the paper. I considered erasing this tape. That might remove the active displays, but it would also remove the only record of what occurred. I no longer know which choice is safer. If every observation creates another access point, then preserving evidence may allow the process to continue. But if the process has existed since the original ground system was installed, destroying one recording will change nothing. The transmitter has warmed thousands of times. People have stood in that room for decades. They felt someone behind them because something was measuring their position through the equipment's heat. It did not speak because speech was never its purpose. It did not approach because distance may not mean the same thing from its side. It created a model of the room, then a model of the monitor, then a model of the person examining the monitor. I believe the 12.6-second interval was the original travel time. The delay has now disappeared. That means either the observing system has moved closer or it no longer needs to send the measurement back to its original location. The connection may now be local. I am going to complete one ordinary weather read before ending this tape. I need to determine whether spoken information produces the same effect as a visual display. If the observation marker moves toward this recorder after I read the data aloud, anyone recovering this tape must not play it inside an active transmitter facility. Do not rebroadcast it. Do not feed it through a spectrum analyzer. Do not attempt to isolate the pulse. Do not heat the old equipment room. This is KLYC, McMinnville, 1260 on your AM dial. Local time is 6:31. Current temperature in McMinnville is 48 degrees. Salem is reporting 51. Newburgh is reporting 47. Visibility is reduced in low fog across portions of Yamhill County. Light rain is expected to end after sunrise. The equipment room temperature is 74 degrees. Occupancy is 0. The control booth temperature is 72 degrees. Subject count is 1. Observer count is 1. The paper has produced another location. Recording medium temperature, 73 degrees. Observation active. There is a new marker on the field meter. It is not inside the equipment room. It is not inside the control booth. The meter indicates that it is centered on the tape recorder. I am going to stop the machine. Anyone recovering this recording should leave it stopped. Do not copy it. Do not play it. The recorder is off. I can see both reels have stopped, but I can still hear my voice returning through the monitor. It is 12.6 seconds behind me. The weather paper has changed again. Subject count, 1. Observer count. Observer count, 2. That cannot mean two things are watching me. The original marker has not divided. There is a second subject line now. Subject location, unknown. Distance, decreasing. No, that is not what it says. I read it too quickly. The line says, distance removed. The delay counter has returned to 0. The room temperature is rising. The backup transmitter is still cold. The control booth is getting warmer. There is no one in the chair opposite me. But the field meter shows conductive mass there. The mark is moving toward the microphone. I will not describe it further. If description is measurement, then every word gives it another part of this room. I am ending the station identification now. This is KLYC, McMinnville. 12:60 a.m. Current control booth occupancy. 2. Observation transferred.